The Echoes of Belrose Manor. The story unfolds beneath the soft breath of autumn, when the fog rolled over the riverbanks and the last roses of the season clung to their fading blush along the wrought-iron fences of the Belrose estate. The manor had stood there for centuries, its windows half-shuttered, its gardens tangled and wild, as though time had forgotten it, but rumor never had. They said the manor hummed with a presence. A piano that played by itself at night. A light that glowed in the study when no one was home. And a woman's figure sometimes seen walking along the balcony, barefoot, her white dress stirring like smoke. When Julian Marchand arrived at Belrose, it was not for romance, nor for ghosts. He came with the sharp air of a man who had once believed in reason and now carried the ache of disillusion. A historian from the University of Lyon, he had been invited to catalogue the letters and manuscripts of the late Marquis d'Artois, whose descendants wished to donate them to a museum. Belrose Manor, the ancestral home, had been closed for decades, until recently inherited by a distant relative, one Madame Evangeline Belrose, who lived abroad and rarely visited. Julian's carriage reached the long, tree-lined lane just after dusk. The iron gates groaned open as though protesting his arrival. The caretaker, an older man named Henri, met him with a lantern. "You'll find it lonely here," Henri said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "The wind speaks too often, and sometimes it remembers more than we'd like." Julian smiled politely. "I'm used to silence." But silence at Belrose was not emptiness, it was presence. Inside, the manor breathed. Dust motes swirled through candlelight like drifting spirits. The portraits of the Belrose lineage lined the corridors. Stern men, melancholic women, eyes that seemed to follow as he passed. His chamber overlooked the garden, where marble statues leaned under ivy, and a fountain still whispered though it no longer flowed. That night, as he unpacked his notes, Julian heard it. Faint, delicate, piano music, somewhere deep in the house. The melody trembled, beautiful yet sorrowful, like a memory refusing to fade. He followed the sound, candle in hand, down the long gallery to the music room. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, moonlight spilled over the grand piano. The keys moved, just barely, as though brushed by invisible hands. Then the sound stopped. "Hello," Julian whispered. The silence that answered felt almost alive. He stepped closer. The piano was old, ivory-chipped, its mahogany frame carved with vines and roses. A thin layer of dust lay across it, except for a few clean prints on the keys. He touched them. Warm. When he turned, he saw her. At first, he thought it was his mind adjusting to the dim light. The outline of a woman near the window, her gown pale, her hair unbound. Her face, he could not see clearly, only that she looked young and sorrowful. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I didn't mean to intrude." Her lips parted, as if she would answer, but no sound came. Then, as the clouds shifted and the moonlight grew stronger, she was gone. Julian stood for a long moment, heart racing, candle trembling in his hand. When he returned to his room, he tried to reason. Perhaps a trick of the eye, exhaustion, the echo of an old melody stored in the air. Yet sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, standing in the pale glow, with sorrow in her eyes. The following days passed in quiet rhythm. He began his work in the library, a cavernous room filled with dust and forgotten history. The Belrose letters were stored in wooden chests, their seals brittle with age. He read by the tall windows, where light fell like water through stained glass, and sometimes, when the air grew still, he could almost hear faint footsteps along the corridor. One afternoon, while sorting through the correspondence of the late Marquis, Julian found a packet wrapped in faded silk. Inside were letters addressed simply to E. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, unmistakably feminine. The first began, "My dearest Julian." He froze. It was his name. Yet the letter was dated 1846, nearly 2 centuries earlier. He read on, "My dearest Julian, I heard the piano again tonight. The song you wrote for me. It follows me now, even when I walk by the river. Perhaps love does not die, it merely waits, like music between notes." Julian sat back, his pulse unsteady. Another letter followed, then another, all written to the same name. They spoke of a forbidden love, of secret meetings in the garden, of promises made under a crimson sky. The writer signed each one simply, Evangeline. Evangeline Belrose, the same name as the Manor's distant inheritor. He felt a strange pull, as if time itself had thinned, and someone, had recognized him. That night, it rained. The house moaned in the wind. Julian dreamed of candlelight flickering across stone walls, of a young woman seated at the piano, tears slipping down her cheeks as she played. In the dream, she turned toward him and whispered, "You came back too late." He woke before dawn. Unable to rest, he descended to the study, where the letters lay spread across the table. A candle burned low beside them. The room was colder than before. On the piano bench sat a small object, a silver locket, old and tarnished. He had not seen it there earlier. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman, her face soft, her eyes familiar in a way that made his breath falter. He turned the locket over. On the back was engraved, "E.B. for Julian." The piano key beside it pressed down with a soft, resonant note, though no one sat there. Julian whispered into the silence, "Evangeline." And for a fleeting moment, he thought he heard her answer, "Yes." From that night on, the line between the living and the remembered began to blur. He spoke to her, sometimes in thought, sometimes aloud, and the Manor seemed to listen. The candles burned longer when he worked late. The letters turned their own pages, as if guiding him to the next revelation. He discovered the truth in fragments. Evangeline Belrose had been the daughter of the Marquis, promised to a nobleman from Bordeaux, but in secret she had fallen in love with a young composer hired to teach her the piano. His name, Julian Mosso. Their affair had been uncovered. The composer was dismissed, and Evangeline confined to the estate. When he tried to return for her, a storm swept across the valley. His carriage overturned near the bridge. He was never found. A month later, Evangeline vanished. They said she drowned herself in the river. Others whispered she wandered into the forest and never returned. But those who lived near Belrose claimed that, on certain nights, they could still hear her piano, the song he had written for her, echoing through the mist. Julian Marchand read until his vision blurred. The coincidence of names felt too heavy, too deliberate. He was drawn to her as though her sorrow had waited centuries for him to return. Days turned into weeks. He neglected his correspondence, forgot the reason for his visit. He spent evenings at the piano, learning the melody from the letter's fragments. Sometimes, when he struck the final note, he swore he felt a hand upon his shoulder. Light, fleeting, gone before he could turn. Henri, the caretaker, began to notice. "You look pale, monsieur," he said one morning. "The Manor keeps its own company. Best not to listen too closely." But Julian couldn't stop. Each night, the music grew clearer. And sometimes, in the mirror's reflection, he saw her standing beside him. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, he walked to the river. The fog hung low over the water, swallowing the world in silence. A single lantern glowed near the bridge, the place where Julian Mosso had perished long ago. She was there. Evangeline stood by the railing, her white dress rippling like mist. She turned, her eyes luminous, sorrow and tenderness intertwined. "You found the letters," she said softly, her voice like the wind through leaves. Julian stepped closer. "You've been waiting for me." "I waited for him," she whispered. "And now the house remembers you instead." He wanted to touch her, to assure her that whatever time had stolen, love could mend. But when he reached out, his hand passed through hers like smoke. The lantern flickered. The fog thickened. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you still listen," she said. "You still hear the song." The river stirred, a cold wind rising. Her image began to fade. "Wait," he said, desperate. "Don't go." She smiled faintly, a tear glimmering like a star. "When the piano stops, so will I." He tried to follow, but the mist swallowed her whole. Only the echo of the melody lingered, soft, broken, eternal. That night, Julian played the song one last time. Every note trembled with longing. As he reached the final chord, the candles went out, one by one, until only moonlight remained. He felt her presence beside him. "Goodbye," she whispered. And when dawn came, the piano was silent. Henri found him asleep at the instrument, the silver locket clasped in his hand. He never spoke of what had happened, only requested to stay until spring to finish his work. When he finally left Belrose, the letters were carefully sealed, the locket returned to the drawer. But sometimes, when travelers passed the old manor on misty evenings, they swore they heard music drifting from the open window, a melody so tender it could only have been written by someone in love. And in the reflection of the piano's polished surface, a man and a woman danced slowly, their figures faint, their faces serene, as if after all those years, they had found a place where time could no longer part them. The manor still stands, shrouded in ivy and memory. The garden blooms each spring with pale roses that no one plants. And on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you might hear it, the faint echo of a piano, and the sigh of a woman who waits, not for sorrow, but for the moment when love returns with the morning fog.